The iron tang of blood on fresh snow was something Callum Quinn had learned to recognize during his years tracking cattle thieves and outlaws across the Arizona Territory. But finding a riderless mare with crimson spattered across her saddle on a December morning in 1884 sent ice through his veins that had nothing to do with the unexpected blizzard sweeping down from the Chiricahua Mountains. The chestnut mare stood trembling near the outskirts of Douglas, her reins dragging in the powder, foam crusting at her bit. And Callum knew with absolute certainty that whoever had been riding her was hurt bad and likely dying somewhere in this God-forsaken storm that had blown in overnight, transforming the usually dusty Arizona landscape into something unrecognizable. He caught the mare's reins with gentle hands, murmuring soft words as he examined her. The blood on the saddle was fresh, still tacky to the touch despite the freezing temperatures, and there was more of it than he wanted to see. A woman's saddle, he noted, smaller than what a man would ride, with a bedroll tied behind and saddlebags that spoke of someone who had been traveling with purpose. The mare wore the brand of the Williams Ranch, a spread about 15 miles south, and Callum felt his jaw tighten as he spotted the trail leading back the way the horse had come, drops of red marking the white snow like a string of terrible breadcrumbs. He swung up onto his own gelding, a steady bay named Copper, and took the mare's reins in hand. The wind howled around him, cutting through his heavy coat and the woolen scarf wrapped around his face. But Callum Quinn had never been the kind of man to let a soul die alone in the cold when he could do something about it. The blood trail led northeast, back toward the foothills where the terrain grew rougher, and the pinyon pines clustered thick enough to provide some shelter from the storm. Every few yards, he found more blood, and his heart hammered harder in his chest as he urged Copper forward through drifts that were already knee-deep on the horses. The trail led him nearly 2 miles before he found her. She was slumped against a boulder, half buried in snow that had drifted around her still form, and for one terrible moment Callum thought he was too late. Then he saw her chest rise with a shallow breath, and he was off Copper before he could think, stumbling through the snow to reach her side. She was young, maybe 23 or 24, with dark hair that had come loose from its braid and skin that was far too pale except where blood stained her riding jacket. Her eyes were closed, her lips tinged blue, and when Callum pulled back her coat, he found the source of all that blood. A gunshot wound high on her left shoulder, still seeping despite the cold that should have helped slow the bleeding. "Hey now, stay with me," he said, his voice rough as he pulled off his gloves and pressed his bandana against the wound. Her eyes fluttered open, gray as the storm clouds overhead, and she looked at him with confusion and pain warring across her delicate features. "My horse," she whispered, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely form the words. "Luna," she ran. "I found her. She's fine, but you are not, and we need to get you somewhere warm right now." Callum did not wait for an argument. He shrugged out of his heavy coat and wrapped it around her, then scooped her up in his arms as carefully as he could manage. She cried out at the movement, a sound that cut through him worse than the wind, but he had no choice. If he left her here while he went for help, she would be dead before he made it back. The nearest shelter was an old line shack he knew about, maybe a mile west, and he prayed it was still standing and that he could find it in this white hell. Getting her onto Copper was an exercise in controlled panic. The gelding stood steady while Callum hauled himself up one-handed, the woman cradled against his chest, her blood soaking into his shirt. She had stopped shivering, which was worse than if she had still been shaking, and he kicked Copper into as fast a walk as he dared while leading the mare behind them. The world had become nothing but white and wind and the terrible weight of the dying woman in his arms. He found the lined shack more by luck and instinct than anything else, a dark shape materializing out of the storm like an answered prayer. The door hung crooked on its leather hinges, but the roof looked intact, and that was all that mattered. Callum half fell through the doorway, his legs numb from the cold, and laid her down as gently as he could on the packed dirt floor. The shack was small, maybe 10 feet square, with a stone fireplace that someone had used recently enough that there was still wood stacked beside it, and the chimney was clear of debris. He got a fire going with shaking hands, coaxing the flames to life with dead pine needles and small twigs before adding larger pieces. Only when heat began to fill the small space did he turn his full attention to the woman. She was unconscious again, her breathing shallow and rapid, and Callum knew he was in a race against time. He had learned field medicine during his years as a scout for the cavalry, had sewn up more wounds than he cared to remember, but this was different. This mattered in a way that made his hands want to shake, as he pulled his saddlebag close and dug out the supplies he always carried. He cut away her jacket and the blouse beneath, trying not to think about the impropriety of it, focused only on the bullet wound that had torn through the meat of her shoulder. The bullet had gone clean through, which was the only bit of luck she had gotten, but the wound was ugly and still bleeding. Callum cleaned it as best he could with water from his canteen and whiskey from his flask, packed it with clean cloth, and bound it tight. Her skin was like ice under his fingers, and he knew the blood loss and exposure had pushed her to the edge of what a body could survive. He wrapped her in both their coats and the saddle blankets from both horses, then pulled her close to the fire. The storm raged outside, but inside the shack, the temperature was slowly climbing, and Callum sat beside her through the long hours of that first day, adding wood to the fire and checking her breathing, willing her to live with a ferocity that surprised him. He did not even know her name, but the thought of this young woman dying alone in the wilderness filled him with a rage he had not felt since his own sister had died of fever 5 years before, too far from help for anything he did to matter. She woke near sunset, her gray eyes opening slowly and fixing on his face with confusion. "Where?" she started, her voice barely a whisper. "Line shack in the foothills. You were shot. Do you remember what happened?" Callum kept his voice gentle, the way he would talk to a spooked horse. She closed her eyes and he saw her throat work as she swallowed. "Bandits, 3 of them, stopped me on the road south of Bisbee. I thought if I gave them my money they would let me go." Her voice broke. "One of them shot me anyway, just laughed and shot me." Rage, hot and sharp, lanced through Callum's chest. "Did you see their faces? One had a scar. Here." She lifted a trembling hand to indicate her right cheek. "Red beard. He was the one who shot me." Callum knew that description. Jake Morrison, a low-down killer who had been terrorizing the territory for months. "You are lucky to be alive." "Do not feel very lucky," she said, and there was a ghost of humor in those words that made him think she was tougher than she looked. "What is your name?" "Callum Quinn." "I run a small ranch west of Douglas. Found your horse wandering without you, followed your blood trail back." "Lillian Williams." She paused, studying his face in the firelight. "You saved my life, Mr. Quinn. Call me Callum, and I have not saved anything yet. That wound could still go bad, and we are stuck here until this storm breaks. Could be days." She nodded slightly, then winced at the movement. "My father will be worried. I was supposed to meet him in Douglas 3 days ago." "John Williams?" Callum asked, recognizing the name. Everyone in this part of Arizona knew of Williams and his sprawling cattle operation. "Yes, you know him." "Know of him. Good man from what I hear." Callum reached for his canteen. "You should drink something." He helped her sit up enough to sip water, supporting her with an arm around her shoulders, careful of her wound. She was shaking again, but he thought it was more from pain than cold now. When she finished drinking, she sagged back against the saddle blankets he had fashioned into a makeshift bed. "Thank you," she whispered, her eyes already closing, "for not leaving me." "Never crossed my mind," Callum said, and realized with some surprise that it was the absolute truth. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days during which Callum kept the fire burning, melted snow for water, and rationed the dried beef and hardtack from his saddlebags. 3 days during which Lillian drifted in and out of fever, sometimes lucid, and other times lost in delirium where she called for her mother and spoke of things that made no sense. Callum stayed beside her through all of it, cooling her forehead with snow-dampened cloth and changing the dressing on her wound, relieved when it showed no signs of infection beyond some redness around the edges. During the hours when she was awake and clear-headed, they talked. He learned that she was 24, that her mother had died when she was 16, that she had been in Tucson visiting an aunt and had decided to come home early because she missed the ranch and her father. She had a sharp wit when the pain was not overwhelming her, and a way of looking at him that made Callum feel like she saw more than he intended to show. She learned that he was 27, that he had built his small ranch from nothing over the past 4 years, that he had no family left except a cousin back in Texas he had not seen in a decade. He told her about his time as a cavalry scout, about the things he had seen that had made him want nothing more than a quiet life with good horses and open sky. He did not tell her about the nightmares, or about how some mornings he woke up not knowing if he wanted to face another day of isolation and hard work with no one to share it with. On the 3rd night, Lillian's fever broke. Callum woke from an uneasy doze to find her watching him, her eyes clear and focused in the firelight. "You look exhausted," she said softly. "Been a long few days." He sat up, scrubbing a hand over his face, feeling the rasp of 3 days' worth of beard growth. "How do you feel?" "Like I was shot and nearly froze to death, but better than yesterday." She shifted carefully, propping herself up on her good elbow. "The storm sounds like it is letting up." Callum listened and realized she was right. The howling wind had dropped to a moan, and the sharp rattle of snow against the walls had stopped. "We should be able to move out come morning if you think you can ride." "I can ride." There was steel in her voice, the determination of someone who had grown up in this hard country and knew what it took to survive. "My father is probably half crazy with worry by now." "He raised a tough daughter," Callum said, and was rewarded with a small smile. "He raised me to handle a ranch, to sit a saddle as well as any man, to shoot straight and think for myself. I suppose that counts as tough." She paused, her expression growing serious. "Callum, I need to ask you something. When you get me home, will you help my father track down the men who did this?" He met her eyes across the fire. "I was planning on it whether you asked or not. Jake Morrison has been preying on travelers for too long. Should have been hanged months ago. You know him, know of him. He and his boys have hit 3 stages and a handful of lone travelers. Territorial Marshal has been looking for him, but Morrison knows the country too well and never stays in one place long enough to pin down." Callum fed another piece of wood into the flames. "But he made a mistake shooting you. Your father has enough pull to make sure the law takes this serious, and I know these mountains better than most. We will find him." Lillian nodded, but there was something in her face that made Callum think she was afraid, though she was trying hard not to show it. "I keep seeing his face. The way he smiled when he pulled the trigger, like it was funny. Hey." Callum moved closer without thinking, reaching out to touch her uninjured shoulder. "You survived. That takes away his power. He is just another outlaw who is going to swing from a rope and you are going home." She looked up at him, and in the firelight her eyes were luminous with unshed tears. I was so scared, lying there in the snow, knowing I was bleeding, knowing my horse had run off and no one knew where I was. I thought I was going to die alone. You did not die. And you were not alone, not once I found you. His hand was still on her shoulder, and he could feel her trembling. You are one of the bravest people I have ever met, Lillian Williams. She reached up and covered his hand with her own, her fingers cold but steady. I think you might be the best man I have ever met, Callum Quinn. Something shifted in that moment, something neither of them had words for, but both felt like a physical presence in the small shack. Callum became suddenly aware of how close they were, of the fact that they had been alone together for 3 days in this tiny space, of the way his heart was beating faster than it had any reason to. He should pull away, should put proper distance between them, but he could not seem to make himself move. Lillian's hand tightened on his. When you found me, when I first opened my eyes and saw you there, I thought maybe I had died and you were an angel. A small, self-deprecating smile crossed her face. Foolish, I know, not foolish. His voice had gone rough without his permission. I thought you might be dying when I found you, thought I might have to watch you slip away, and I realized. He stopped, uncertain how to finish that sentence. Realized what? She prompted gently. That I had not cared that much about whether someone lived or died in a very long time, not since my sister. I have been going through the motions for years, building my ranch because it gave me something to do, but not really caring about much of anything. He met her eyes. You made me care. A complete stranger, and I would have given anything to keep you alive. Lillian's expression softened into something that made Callum's breath catch. Maybe we were supposed to meet. Maybe all of this happened exactly the way it was supposed to, so that we would end up here, right now, talking like this. That is a strange way to look at getting shot and nearly dying, Callum said, but there was no mockery in his tone. My mother used to say that God works in mysterious ways, that sometimes the worst things lead to the best things if we are brave enough to see it through. Lillian's eyes searched his face. I think she might have been right. They stayed like that for a long moment, hands joined, the fire crackling between them, and Callum felt something he had not felt in years. Hope. Hope that maybe his life could be more than just existing from one day to the next, that maybe there was a reason he had been on that road at exactly the right time to find a riderless horse in the snow. Morning came cold and bright, the storm having blown itself out during the night. Callum helped Lillian onto Luna, fashioning a sling for her arm from a torn shirt to keep the wounded shoulder immobilized. She was pale and clearly hurting, but she set her jaw and gathered the reins with her good hand, and Callum felt that surge of admiration again for her sheer toughness. They rode out into a transformed landscape where the desert floor lay hidden under 8 inches of snow, and the mountains gleamed white against a painfully blue sky. The ride to Douglas took most of the day, going slow to spare Lillian as much jostling as possible. Callum kept watching her, ready to stop the moment she showed signs of flagging, but she held on with grim determination. They talked little, saving their energy for the journey, but there was a comfortable quality to the silence between them that spoke of something deeper than the few days they had known each other. They reached Douglas as the sun was dropping toward the western mountains, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. The town was small, maybe 300 souls, but it had a doctor and a telegraph office, and those were the things that mattered. Callum headed straight for the doctor's house, a neat adobe building on the east side of town, and helped Lillian down from her saddle with gentle hands. Dr. Samuel Harrison was a gruff man in his 50s who took one look at Lillian's makeshift bandage and ushered them inside without questions. Callum waited in the front room while Harrison examined her, his hands clenched into fists at his sides as he listened to her soft sounds of pain through the thin wall. When the doctor finally emerged, his expression was approving. Someone knew what they were doing with field dressing that wound. "You," Harrison looked at Callum. "Yes, sir, learned it in the cavalry." "Well, you likely saved her life. Another few hours in that cold and she would not have made it." Harrison wiped his hands on a cloth. "She is going to be fine. Wound is clean, no infection. She needs rest and proper food, but she will heal up good as new. Might have limited mobility in that shoulder for a few months, but should be back to normal by spring." Relief hit Callum so hard his knees went weak. "Thank you. Thank yourself. I just put in a few stitches and gave her something for the pain." Harrison studied him with shrewd eyes. "She says you tracked her through that blizzard and kept her alive for 3 days in a lined shack. That is some fine work, son." Before Callum could respond, the door banged open, and a big man in a sheepskin coat burst in, snow still clinging to his boots. He had gray streaking his dark hair and lines carved deep around his eyes and mouth, and Callum knew him immediately from description. John Williams, one of the most successful ranchers in southern Arizona. "Where is she?" Williams demanded, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. "The telegraph said Lillian was here, that she had been shot. In the back room, Mr. Williams, and she is going to be fine." Harrison moved to intercept him. "But you need to calm yourself before you go back there. She has been through hell and does not need you thundering in like the wrath of God." Williams took a visible breath, forcing himself to settle. His eyes found Callum. "You the one who brought her in?" "Yes, sir, Callum Quinn." He offered his hand. Williams took it in a grip that could have crushed stone. "The telegraph did not give me details." "What happened?" Callum told him, keeping his voice level and factual, watching Williams's face darken with rage as he described the bandits and the shooting. When he got to the part about tracking Lillian through the snow, Williams's expression shifted to something that might have been awe. "You followed a blood trail in a blizzard for 2 miles and kept my daughter alive for 3 days. It was not a question." "Yes, sir. Any decent man would have done the same." "That is where you are wrong, son. Most men would have seen that storm coming and holed up somewhere safe, figured whoever lost that horse was already dead. You went after her anyway." Williams's voice had gone rough. "You gave me back the only family I have left. There are not words for what that means." Callum felt heat climb his neck. "She is tough as nails, your daughter, did most of the surviving on her own. I just helped a little." "I want to see her," Williams said, turning back to Harrison. The doctor nodded. "Go on back, but keep it short. She needs rest." Williams disappeared through the doorway, and Callum heard Lillian's cry of relief, the low rumble of her father's voice. Harrison clapped him on the shoulder. "You are welcome to wash up and get something to eat. My wife always makes too much food." "I appreciate that, but I should see to the horses and find somewhere to stay for the night." Callum headed for the door, suddenly exhausted now that the crisis was over. "Quinn." Harrison's voice stopped him. "You planning to help track down the men who did this?" Callum turned back. "Yes, sir. Jake Morrison needs to hang, and I mean to see that it happens." "Good. This territory needs more men like you." Harrison paused. "And just so you know, the way that girl looks at you is not the way someone looks at just any man who helped them out of trouble. Might want to think on that." Callum felt his face heat again, but he just nodded and stepped out into the cold evening air. "The way that girl looks at you." He thought about Lillian's gray eyes in the firelight, about the feel of her hand on his, about the strange certainty that had settled over him during those 3 days in the lined shack. He had saved her life, yes, but somehow in the process she had brought his own life back into focus. had made him remember what it felt like to want something more than just getting through another day. He stabled the horses at the livery, paying extra for good grain and rub-downs, then found a room at the boarding house that served as Douglas's main hotel. He washed off 3 days of grime and smoke, shaved, and put on the clean shirt from his saddlebag. It was full dark by then, and his stomach was reminding him that he had been rationing food for days. He headed for the saloon, figuring to get a hot meal and maybe a beer before turning in. The saloon was warm and loud, full of ranchers and miners and townspeople escaping the cold. Callum found a table in the corner and ordered steak and potatoes and coffee hot enough to scald. He was halfway through the meal when John Williams found him. "Mind if I sit?" Williams did not wait for an answer, pulling out a chair and dropping into it with a heavy sigh. "Been a long day." "How is Lillian?" Callum asked. "Resting. Dr. Harrison gave her something to help her sleep, and my foreman is sitting outside her room to make sure no one bothers her." Williams signaled the bartender for whiskey. "I want to talk to you about Jake Morrison." Callum set down his fork. "I am listening. Territorial Marshal is in Tombstone right now, but I sent him a telegraph. He will be here day after tomorrow, and he is bringing a deputy. I want you to ride with us when we go after Morrison and his boys." Williams leaned forward. "You know this country you can track, and from what Lillian told me, you can handle yourself in a tight spot. I need men I can trust." "I will do it," Callum said without hesitation. "But I need to check on my ranch first, make sure my hired hand knows I will be gone a few more days." "Fair enough. We probably will not ride out until the end of the week anyway, give the snow a chance to melt off some and give the marshal time to get here." Williams accepted his whiskey from the bartender and took a long swallow. "You married Quinn?" The question caught Callum off guard. "No, sir. Never found the right woman, and ranching does not leave much time for courting." "But you are not opposed to the idea of marriage?" Callum felt a prickle of wariness. "I suppose not if the right woman came along. Why do you ask?" Williams studied him over the rim of his glass. "Because my daughter has not stopped talking about you since she woke up. Because in all her 24 years, I have never seen her look at a man the way she looked when she said your name. And because I think you feel the same way about her, whether you have admitted it to yourself yet or not." Callum opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "Mr. Williams, I know how this must look, but I promise you I never did anything improper. I was just trying to keep her alive." "I know that, son. I am not questioning your honor. I am just telling you what I see." Williams set down his glass. "Lillian is all I have left in this world. Her mother, my Martha, died 8 years ago, and there has not been a day since that I have not missed her. I want my daughter to be happy, to find a good man who will treat her right and give her the life she deserves. From what I have seen and from what she has told me, you might be that man." Callum felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. "Sir, I barely know her. We spent 3 days in a line shack, most of which she was unconscious or feverish. That is hardly a basis for courtship. Maybe not by conventional standards. But sometimes people know. Martha and I knew within a week of meeting that we were going to get married. 32 years we had together, and I would not trade a single day of it." Williams's voice had gone soft with memory. "I am not saying you need to propose tomorrow. I am just saying that if you have feelings for my daughter, you should not let fear or propriety or the fact that you do not have as much money as some other men stop you from exploring those feelings. Life is too short and too hard out here to waste time on what society says we should or should not do." "Does Lillian know you are having this conversation with me?" Callum asked. "Hell no, and if you tell her I will deny every word." Williams grinned suddenly. "But she is stubborn as a mule, and she has already announced that she wants to see you tomorrow. So be ready for that." They talked a while longer, William sharing stories about Lillian's childhood, about Martha, about the years of building his ranch from nothing. Callum found himself liking the older man, appreciating his directness and his obvious deep love for his daughter. When they finally parted ways near midnight, William shook his hand again and said, "Thank you for bringing her home, son. Whatever happens next, you gave me back everything that matters. I will not forget that." Callum lay awake for a long time in his narrow boarding house bed, staring at the ceiling and thinking about gray eyes and a hand covering his in firelight. He thought about the way Lillian had looked at him with trust absolute, when she should have been terrified. He thought about the strange ache in his chest when he imagined saying goodbye to her, imagined going back to his empty ranch and his empty life where nothing really mattered because there was no one to share it with. Maybe Williams was right. Maybe sometimes people just knew. He woke early, dressed carefully, and made his way to the doctor's house as the sun was painting the snow-covered street in shades of gold. Harrison's wife answered the door and ushered him in with a knowing smile that made Callum wonder if the whole town had already heard about how he had brought in John Williams's daughter. Lillian was sitting up in bed, her wounded shoulder wrapped in clean white bandages, her dark hair brushed and hanging loose over her good shoulder. She was wearing a borrowed nightgown that was too big for her, but her eyes were bright and clear and her face lit up when she saw him. "Callum, I was hoping you would come." She held out her good hand and he took it, acutely aware of Harrison's wife bustling out of the room to give them privacy. "How are you feeling?" He pulled a chair close to the bed. "Sore, tired, alive." Her fingers tightened on his. "Thanks to you. You would have made it on your own. You are too stubborn to die." She laughed, then winced. "Do not make me laugh, it hurts." Her expression grew serious. "My father told me you are going to help track down Morrison." "I am. He needs to answer for what he did to you. Be careful, please. I just found you, and the thought of you getting hurt because of me." She trailed off, her eyes suspiciously bright. "Hey." Callum reached up to cup her cheek with his free hand, the gesture natural and right despite the fact that they had known each other less than a week. "I have been handling outlaws and bad men for a long time. I will be fine. And when I get back, I would like to call on you proper if that would be all right." Her breath caught. "Call on me, court you if I am using the wrong words. I know it is fast, and I know your father probably has half a dozen rich ranchers' sons lined up hoping for your hand. But I cannot stop thinking about you, Lillian. Cannot stop thinking about those 3 days and the way you looked at me, and the way I felt like I was finally alive again for the first time in years." The words were pouring out of him now, unstoppable. "I do not have much. My ranch is small and I am still building it up. But I work hard and I do not drink to excess and I have never hit a woman or a horse. And I think maybe I could make you happy if you gave me the chance." Lillian's eyes were streaming now, but she was smiling through the tears. "You absolute fool. Do you think I care about money or ranch size? You saved my life. You held my hand through the fever and kept me from giving up when all I wanted was to close my eyes and let go. You looked at me like I mattered, like I was worth fighting for." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I think I started falling in love with you somewhere in that lined shack, between the fear and the pain and the cold. And yes, Callum Quinn, you may absolutely call on me proper. I would like nothing better." He kissed her then, a soft brush of lips that was equal parts promise and question. She kissed him back, her good hand coming up to tangle in his hair, and Callum felt something lock into place in his chest, something that had been missing his entire life finally clicking home. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Lillian rested her forehead against his. "Come back safe. I have plans for you, Cowboy." "Yes, madam," he said, and heard the smile in his own voice. I will do my very best. The territorial marshal arrived 2 days later, a lean man named Tom Crawford who had a reputation for being fair-minded and relentless. He brought one deputy, a quiet Texan named Bill Hart, who carried 2 pistols and a Winchester, and looked like he knew how to use all 3. John Williams contributed 3 of his best ranch hands, all steady men who could shoot and ride. Callum made 6, and Crawford declared it a good number for hunting down 3 outlaws. They rode out on a cold, clear morning, following information Crawford had gathered that suggested Morrison and his men were holing up in the Pedregosa Mountains about 30 miles northeast. Lillian came to see them off despite her father's protests, her arm still in a sling but her eyes fierce as she looked at the assembled men. "Bring him in alive if you can," she said, her voice carrying in the crisp air. "I want to see him hang legal and proper, not shot down like a dog." "We will do our best, Miss Williams," Crawford said, touching his hat brim. "But if it comes down to him or us, I cannot promise anything. I know, just be careful." Her eyes found Callum's. "All of you." The ride northeast took them through country Callum knew well. High desert terrain studded with mesquite and prickly pear, the snow already melting into muddy patches under the bright sun. Crawford was a good leader, methodical and careful, and they made steady progress. At night, they camped in arroyos and ate cold food, not wanting to advertise their presence with campfires. Callum found himself thinking about Lillian constantly, about the kiss they had shared, about the future that suddenly seemed possible in a way it never had before. On the 3rd day, they found Morrison's camp in a rocky canyon near an old played-out silver mine. Crawford sent Callum and Hart to circle around to the back while he and the others approached from the front, meaning to trap the outlaws between them. It was good planning, but Morrison was not a fool. He spotted Crawford's approach and opened fire, and suddenly the canyon was full of gunshots and ricocheting bullets and men shouting. Callum came down from the rocks behind the camp and saw Morrison trying to reach the horses picketed at the canyon's far end. Without thinking, Callum raised his rifle and put a bullet into the ground in front of Morrison's feet. "Federal Marshal," he shouted. "Surrender or die." Morrison spun, his gun coming up, and Callum saw the scar on his right cheek that matched Lillian's description. Rage, cold and clean, swept through him. This was the man who had shot Lillian and left her to die in the snow. This was the man who had laughed while she bled. Morrison fired, and Callum felt the bullet tug at his coat sleeve, but his own shot was already on the way. He aimed for Morrison's gun hand, and his bullet struck true, sending the outlaw's pistol spinning away into the rocks. Morrison went down with a scream, clutching his shattered hand, and Callum was on him before he could reach for the knife on his belt. "Move and I will shoot you in the other hand," Callum said, his voice flat and cold. "And then I will start on your knees." Morrison looked up at him, his face twisted with pain and hate, and something flickered in his eyes that might have been recognition. "You are that girl's man," he said, his voice a snarl. "The one who found her, should have put another bullet in her to make sure." Callum hit him, a short, hard blow that snapped Morrison's head back and split his lip. "You are lucky the lady wants to see you hang, or I would put you down right here." The fight was over quickly after that. Morrison's 2 companions surrendered when they saw their leader taken, and Crawford had them all in irons within the hour. They searched the camp and found money and jewelry from 6 robberies, along with 3 horses that Crawford recognized as having been stolen from a stage attack near Tucson. It was more than enough evidence to hang all 3 men, and Crawford looked satisfied as they started the long ride back to Douglas. They made it back in 2 days, riding straight through with minimal stops. The town turned out to see the outlaws brought in, and Callum saw Lillian standing on the boardwalk outside the marshal's office, her father beside her. Her eyes found his immediately, and the relief on her face made something warm unfurl in his chest. After they had turned the prisoners over to the local law and Crawford had headed off to file his reports, Callum walked over to where Lillian waited. She met him halfway, ignoring propriety and her father's presence, and threw her good arm around his neck. "You are bleeding," she said, pulling back to look at the tear in his sleeve where Morrison's bullet had grazed him. "Just a scratch. I am fine." He cupped her face in both hands. "We got him. It is over." "I know. I heard the shots from here when you brought them in." She leaned into his touch. "I was so worried. I made you a promise to come back safe. I keep my promises." He kissed her forehead, then her cheek, then her lips, not caring that half the town was probably watching. She kissed him back with an intensity that made him forget where they were, and when they broke apart the world had narrowed down to just the two of them, and the future stretching out ahead like an open road. John Williams cleared his throat loudly. "You two want to come up for air, or should I come back later?" Lillian laughed and turned in Callum's arms, leaning back against him. "Stop being embarrassing, father." "I think that is my line," Williams said, but he was smiling. "Quinn, since it seems my daughter has set her cap for you, why do you not come out to the ranch for dinner tomorrow? We can talk about what proper courting looks like when the woman in question is a rancher's daughter." "I would be honored, sir." Callum's arm tightened around Lillian's waist, and he felt her lean into him with a trust and contentment that made his heart ache in the best possible way. The next 6 months passed in a blur of courtship and hard work. Callum divided his time between his own ranch and the Williams spread, learning John Williams's operation while teaching Lillian the particulars of his own smaller but well-run outfit. They rode together when her shoulder had healed enough, exploring the country that had nearly claimed her life. They talked about everything and nothing, discovering shared dreams and compatible temperaments. They argued occasionally, because Lillian had strong opinions and was not shy about voicing them, but they always made up before the sun set because neither could stand the thought of going to bed angry. Morrison and his men were tried, convicted, and hanged in Tucson in early March. Lillian insisted on attending, and Callum stood beside her as the trapdoors dropped and justice was served. She cried afterward, though she said it was not for Morrison, but for the senselessness of all the death and pain men like him caused. Callum held her and promised that he would spend the rest of his life making sure she felt safe and protected. And she had kissed him and said that was exactly what she wanted. He proposed on a warm evening in late May, riding up to a high meadow on his property that overlooked both his ranch and the distant lights of Douglas. He had a ring, simple gold with a small diamond, that had cost him 3 months of savings. He got down on one knee in the prairie grass and asked Lillian Williams to marry him, his voice steady despite the way his heart was hammering. She said yes before he finished the question, dropping down beside him and kissing him with enough enthusiasm that they ended up horizontal in the grass, laughing and holding each other as the stars came out overhead. They stayed up there until late, making plans and dreaming out loud about the life they would build together. They were married in June, a small ceremony in Douglas's little church with half the territory in attendance. Lillian wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit, and Callum wore a new suit that felt strange after so many years in work clothes. John Williams cried openly as he walked his daughter down the aisle, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Callum kissed his bride with a joy so fierce it bordered on pain. They spent their wedding night in the hotel in Douglas, then headed out the next morning to start their life together on Callum's ranch. Williams had given them a dozen head of prime breeding stock as a wedding present, and Lillian's aunt in Tucson had sent enough household goods to outfit their modest cabin. It was not much by some standards, but to Callum, it felt like a palace because Lillian was there, making it a home with her presence and her laughter and her fierce determination to be a full partner in everything they did. The years that followed were good ones, though never easy. Ranching in Arizona Territory was hard work, with drought and disease and outlaws all taking their toll. But Callum and Lillian built their operation together, side by side, and the ranch grew from a small outfit to a respectable spread that employed 3 full-time hands and ran 200 head of cattle. John Williams became not just a father-in-law but a true friend, someone Callum could rely on for advice and support, and the 3 of them formed a bond that transcended mere business partnership. Their first child, a boy they named Thomas John after both grandfathers, was born in the spring of 1886. Lillian labored for 12 hours while Callum paced holes in the cabin floor, and when Dr. Harrison finally let him in to meet his son, Callum took one look at the tiny red-faced infant and felt his heart expand to a size he had not known was possible. Lillian was exhausted but radiant, and when she looked up at him with their son in her arms, Callum knew that every hard thing he had ever endured had been worth it to get to this moment. 2 years later they had a daughter, Sarah Martha, named for Callum's mother and Lillian's. She had her mother's gray eyes and her father's stubborn chin, and from the moment she could walk, she followed her older brother everywhere, determined never to be left behind. Watching his children grow, teaching Thomas to ride and Sarah to rope a calf, sitting around the dinner table listening to Lillian tell stories about her day, Callum sometimes had to stop and remind himself that this was his life, that he had somehow gotten lucky enough to find everything he had not even known he was looking for. There were hard times, too. The winter of 1889 brought a blizzard that reminded them both of that first terrible storm, and they lost 30 head of cattle to the cold. The drought of 1891 nearly broke them, water running so low that they had to drive the herd 20 miles to find decent grazing. There were accidents and illnesses, hard births and crop failures, all the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to in a hard land. But they weathered it together, Callum and Lillian, and emerged stronger for having survived. John Williams died in the fall of 1893, going peacefully in his sleep at the age of 68. He left the Williams Ranch to Lillian, who combined it with Callum's operation to create one of the largest spreads in southern Arizona. They hired a manager for the Williams place and split their time between the 2 properties, though Callum always thought of the original little cabin as home, the place where they had started their life together. Thomas grew into a serious young man who loved the land as much as his parents did, while Sarah inherited her father's wanderlust and announced at 16 that she wanted to go to California and become a teacher. It broke Callum's heart a little to let her go, but Lillian reminded him that they had raised their children to be strong and independent, and that meant trusting them to find their own paths. Sarah wrote faithfully every week from San Francisco, and her letters were full of wonder and excitement that made the distance easier to bear. In 1899, Arizona was still a territory, but there was talk of statehood, of the wild frontier giving way to civilization and order. Callum was 42 years old, his hair graying at the temples, his hands scarred from decades of hard work. Lillian was 39, still beautiful to him, still the woman who had made him feel alive again all those years ago in a lined shack during a blizzard. They sat on the porch of their ranch house one evening, watching the sun set over the mountains that had witnessed so much of their life together. "You ever think about that day?" Lillian asked, her head resting on his shoulder. "The day you found Luna wandering without me." "Every day," Callum said honestly. "Every single day I wake up grateful that I was on that road at that moment, that I was the one who found your horse. If I had been anywhere else, if I had decided to stay home that morning." He trailed off, not wanting to think about the alternative. "I think we were meant to find each other," Lillian said softly. "I think everything happened exactly the way it was supposed to, even the hard parts, because it led us here. To this life, these children, this love." Callum turned to kiss her, a kiss that still carried the spark of that first kiss in Dr. Harrison's house 18 years before. "I love you, Lillian Quinn, more now than the day I married you, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today." "That is quite a promise, Cowboy." But her eyes were bright with tears, and her smile was the same one that had captured his heart in firelight and snow. "It is the only promise that matters," Callum said, and pulled her close as the sun dropped below the horizon, and the stars began to emerge in the vast Arizona sky. They had 3 more good decades together. Thomas married a girl from Douglas and gave them 5 grandchildren who ran wild across the ranch every summer. Sarah came home from California with a husband who was a history professor and 2 daughters who had their mother's adventurous spirit. The ranch prospered, weathering the transition from territory to state in 1912, adapting to automobiles and telephones, and all the other changes that modernity brought to the desert. Callum lived to see the Wild West he had known as a young man become the stuff of stories and dime novels, a romanticized past that bore little resemblance to the hard reality he remembered. But he did not mind, because he had lived it true, had known what it meant to track a woman through the snow on nothing but faith and determination, had known what it meant to fight for love in a harsh land that gave nothing easily. He died in his sleep in 1928 at the age of 71, with Lillian's hand in his and his family gathered around his bed. His last words were "thank you," though no one was quite sure what he was thanking them for. Lillian knew, though. She knew he was thanking her for the life they had built, for the love they had shared, for being worth saving all those years ago. She followed him less than a year later, her heart simply giving out one spring morning as she sat on the porch watching the sunrise. Thomas found her there, peaceful and smiling, and knew that she had gone to join Callum wherever he was. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch they had built together, their graves marked with simple stones that bore their names and the dates of their lives and the words, "Together always." The ranch stayed in the family for 3 more generations, passed down through Thomas's line, and every child who grew up there heard the story of how it had all started. How their great-great-grandfather had found a riderless horse on a cold December morning and followed a blood trail through the snow to find their great-great-grandmother dying in a blizzard. How he had saved her life and lost his heart in the process. How they had built something strong and true and lasting out of chance and courage and love. It became a family legend, a story told around campfires and dinner tables, embellished with each retelling but always true at its core. Because some stories are too good, too pure, to be anything but real. Some loves are strong enough to last beyond death, to live on in the land they shaped, and the children they raised, and the memory of what it means to be brave enough to follow a trail into the storm, not knowing what you will find, but knowing you have to try. And on winter mornings when the snow fell on the Arizona mountains, when the wind howled and the world turned white and strange, the current generation of Quinns would sometimes stand at the window and think about Callum and Lillian. About a cowboy who refused to let a stranger die alone. About a woman who survived against all odds. About a love story that started with blood in the snow and ended with two lives so completely intertwined that they became one story, one legend, one eternal truth. That love, once found, is worth any hardship. That courage is measured not in grand gestures, but in the decision to keep going, to keep fighting, to keep hoping even when everything seems lost. That sometimes the worst moments of our lives are the doorways to the best moments, if we are brave enough to walk through them. The ranch house still stood, modernized but recognizable, and on the mantel in the living room there was a photograph taken in 1925, 3 years before Callum died. It showed an old man and an old woman sitting on a porch, their hands clasped between them, their faces lined with age and weather and laughter. They were looking at each other, not at the camera, and the love in that gaze was so powerful it transcended the fading sepia tones. Beneath the photograph was a small brass plaque that one of the grandchildren had made, engraved with words Lillian had spoken in an interview for the local newspaper on their 50th wedding anniversary. The reporter had asked her the secret to a long and happy marriage, and her answer had become family gospel. "There is no secret," she had said. "You find the person who makes you want to be brave, who sees you at your worst and loves you anyway, who will follow you into the storm and never let go of your hand. And then you hold on tight and you do not quit, not ever, no matter how hard it gets. Because real love is not about the easy days. It is about the hard days, the impossible days, the days when you are so tired and scared you do not think you can take another step. It is about taking that step anyway together, and trusting that the person beside you will catch you if you fall." She had paused then, her eyes distant with memory, and added, "Callum Quinn tracked me through a blizzard when any sane man would have given up. He kept me alive when I wanted to let go. He gave me a reason to fight, to survive, to hope. And every day since then, for 50 years, he has given me new reasons. That is love. That is marriage. That is the only secret worth knowing." The reporter had written it all down, and the article had been reprinted in newspapers across the state. A love story from the Old West that captured the imagination of a generation growing increasingly disconnected from the harsh realities their grandparents had faced. But for the Quinn family, it was more than a story. It was their history, their foundation, the bedrock truth on which everything else was built. And so the years rolled on, the ranch endured, and the story of Callum and Lillian lived on. A testament to the power of love and courage, and the kind of determination that refuses to quit even when the whole world is white with snow and the trail grows cold and the only thing keeping you going is the knowledge that somewhere ahead, someone is depending on you to not give up. That is how legends are born. Not in grand battles or impossible deeds, but in the quiet moments when someone decides that another person's life matters more than their own comfort, their own safety, their own survival. In the moment when love becomes action, when feeling becomes deed, when the story stops being something that happens to you and becomes something you create through sheer force of will and heart. Callum Quinn had been that kind of man. Lillian Williams had been that kind of woman. And together, they had built that kind of life, the kind that echoes down through the generations, shaping the future by honoring the past, proving that even in the hardest of times, in the wildest of places, love can not only survive but thrive, growing stronger with each passing year until it becomes something close to immortal. Their great-great-grandchildren would never know them except through stories and faded photographs. But they carried that legacy in their blood, in the way they approached the world with courage and compassion, in the way they believed that love was worth fighting for, worth sacrificing for, worth building a life around. And sometimes, On cold winter nights when the snow fell soft and white over the Arizona desert, those descendants would stand at the window and look out at the storm, and think about a cowboy finding a riderless horse, about following a blood trail into the unknown, about refusing to let go even when everything seemed lost. They would think about what it means to love someone enough to track them through a blizzard, to hold their hand through the fever, to promise them forever, and mean it with every fiber of your being. And they would be grateful, so grateful, that Callum Quinn had been the kind of man who could not walk away from someone in need, who could not leave a trail unfollowed, who could not rest until he had done everything in his power to save a life. Because in saving Lillian's life that day, he had saved all their lives too. Every child and grandchild and great-grandchild who came after existed because one man made the choice to be brave, to be decent, to care about a stranger's survival more than his own comfort. That was the real legacy. Not the ranch or the money or the land, but the lesson that love is a verb, not a noun. That it requires action and sacrifice and a willingness to walk into the storm without knowing if you will find what you are looking for. That the greatest adventures often start with the smallest choices, the decision to turn left instead of right, to investigate instead of ignore, to help instead of pass by. Callum and Lillian had taught that lesson with their lives, had embodied it so completely that it became woven into the fabric of their family's identity. And that was enough, more than enough. It was everything.